Thank you so much.
This session has been filled with starts and stops. Distractions like the IEN have derailed conversations about other long-term issues. We sat down with a member of House leadership to find out how the behind-the-scenes negotiations are going and if the Democrats are allowed in on the discussion.
I have asked the Democrats to engage in this conversation, and they have not. They have not. I says, what are some of the ideas that you guys find acceptable, unacceptable, or what like that? They have refused to engage, at least with me, on any of the issues, what they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with. And so I think in order to get things done, we've got to reach within our group. And that's the interesting aspect. We always think, well, we're all Republicans, we all think the same. That ain't true.
The Democrats have said publicly some of what they view might be transportation solutions. Are you saying that they haven't offered these ideas to you or Chairman Palmer or anybody else on the House side?
They haven't offered any to me. I've touched base with the leadership on the Democrat side saying, hey, what would be stumbling blocks to the Democrats and what would be acceptable, and they said, well, we'll see what you guys come back with.
Do you feel like communication is working, not just with the minority party, but also within your own caucus?
I think it's improved considerably. I think that this year there's been a lot more communications between the four people in leadership, and a lot more conversations going along, and a lot more utilization between the four of us. I felt like the first 2 years it was maybe a little bit, the two people that had the experience in leadership were kind of in leadership and I wasn't. And I had decided to make an effort to be more involved, and that's probably why I took up the transportation issue and decided, okay, I'm going to be the one that kind of pushes this one along.
We've seen special interest groups and lobbyist organizations and think tanks rank lawmakers on just about every vote they've taken, whether it's the NRA or Idaho Chooses Life or the Freedom Foundation or what have you. Do you think that your caucus and the House as a whole is looking at issues individually, or are they just kind of checking off the scorecard however they think the NRA wants them to vote, or the Freedom Foundation, or whichever group?
I can't answer for all the members of the caucus. I think there's always going to be a handful, I believe, that will look at those markers. When the food producers puts out, we're tracking this bill, or NRA says this is a bill that counts, or Right to Life does it, or the Freedom Foundation. There's always going to be people that will trigger that. I have got to the policy for myself is I take them all and throw them in the round file. I don't pay any attention from the food producers, Freedom Foundation. I try to vote on the merit of the bill, and I find out later where that is.
And joining us today for the pundits, we have Bill Spence from the Lewiston Tribune, and as always, Dr. Jim Weatherby and Betsy Russell from the Spokesman Review. So, Bill, you've been writing a little bit about the behind-the-scenes negotiations on transportation. Can you fill us in?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that Democrats have not, to this point, introduced any transportation funding legislation. My understanding is that they are working on a package and are hoping to introduce it soon. But from the beginning of the session, House Republicans have been looking for a Republican-only solution to the issue, and one that has 36 Republican votes so that they don't need any Democratic support to pass legislation. That's not because they're necessarily looking to cut out Democrats and keep them from getting any of the congratulations for it. It's more because of Republican infighting, where this ongoing inter-party feuding is they don't want to give ammunition to the more conservative faction in the party to use in the next primary elections.
Jim, what does this do for the party? I know on a national scale where we sometimes see the House and the Senate kind of flip-flop, the president, sometimes we have Republicans, sometimes we have Democrats, but when we have such a overwhelming majority like we do here in the state of Idaho, does this hurt the party long-term as well, saying we're kind of not being all-inclusive, we're just trying to get stuff done, or does this have no impact?
Well, I think it relates to, as Bill talked about, the infighting within the Republican Party, which can be difficult in some states where they're competitive. But here we're talking about how Republicans are going to get together to support a transportation package. In 2013, the insurance exchange was passed, with less than a majority of the Republican Party voting for the exchange. In Congress, there is the Hastert rule that provides, after former Speaker of the House, Republican Denny Hastert, where the legislation coming out of that caucus required a majority of the majority. Now in Idaho, under the Republican leadership in the House, as I understand it, they're looking at 36. They want all of the votes for passage to come out of the Republican caucus. So that's far more than a majority of the majority. If you would apply that across the board for major pieces of legislation over the last few years, very few pieces would pass. And clearly, the 1996 gas tax would not have passed.
So strategically speaking, why? What's the point of the Republican Party doing this? And is it going to hurt? Is it going to tank their chances of passing any sort of transportation funding?
Well, why they're doing that is because of the negative fallout from the voting for the exchange and for a minority of the caucus voting for that exchange.
I think one impact that this approach has is that all of the negotiations, all the hashing out of what policy the state's going to take on these extremely important issues is occurring behind closed doors. In closed Republican caucuses, they're also talking about it in closed Democratic caucuses, but it's not occurring out in front of the public, and the public is not being given any input into it.
And I think part of the real question that's still out there is if they get down towards the end of the session and they don't have major accomplishments that they can point to, will they hold on to this desire for a Republican-only solution, or will they open it up, throw ideas out there that need Democratic support to pass? That isn't clear at this point.
And can you envision a Republican-only solution that would produce a significant tax or fee increase? That's hard for me to see.
Betsy, when we talk about trying to get transportation, we kind of got an indication from leadership this week that there's this possibility we don't get anything done with transportation, and yet at the same time, early on in the session in January and through most of February, we heard that this is an issue they have to pass because we're in dire straits right now. What does this mean for them going forward?
It's interesting to watch how the expectations seem to be lowering, as I think it was Bill who wrote this week, as we near the end of the session. When we went into it, the word was education, transportation, tax cuts, all these big ambitious things were going to happen. When the House Speaker and the Senate President Pro Tem addressed the Idaho Press Club this week, they were down to education and transportation. Tax cuts are pretty much off the table at this point. And now they're even opening the door to transportation not getting done this year, running out of time, and they said straight out in public, it's possible we may just get education funding taken care of and go home.
And one of the other things that Representative Vanderwoode said during our interview with him is that there are still lawmakers who get their scorecards from special interest groups and check them off and use them to not necessarily tell them how to vote, but they pay attention to them. And Jim, you had some thoughts on that.
I don't think there's anything wrong at all with interest groups having their scorecard in terms of trying to hold members accountable, perhaps, that they have supported. But it is interesting to watch that and how that is, in some cases, with the Idaho Freedom Foundation and maybe other groups, had a great influence on voting by members in terms of trying to be considered the most conservative member of the Idaho legislature, so that they are voting more as ideologues rather than looking at individual pieces of legislation. That's too bad, but that's how it works, and that's how groups become effective as well.
But certainly, I mean, if everything was determined by the Idaho Freedom Foundation scorecard, we wouldn't see the tanning bill passing this session, which it is doing, and which the Freedom Foundation has vociferously opposed as the biggest example of the nanny state. This is a bill that's been proposed in 2 previous legislative sessions. And this year, instead of a Democratic bill, it's a Republican bill. It's not quite as far-reaching, but it is passing. It's passed the House. It's cleared the Senate committee where it died in the past, and it looks like it will become law. And of course, the bill now will put the same restrictions on minors' use of artificial tanning beds that we currently have in Idaho for tattoos and piercing. That seems fairly logical. People seem to be buying that.
Jim, I know we kind of want to